Memphis is a modest community of roughly 26,000 residents situated on the Arkansas side of the Mississippi River, directly opposite Memphis, Tennessee. In the early 1990s, the town was relatively quiet. Its population spread across a few neighborhoods and a small town school system. The tranquility of the town would be shattered in early May 1993 when three of its youngest citizens vanished. All three boys were 8 years old and close friends who spent much of their free time together as Cub Scouts. First was Stevie Branch. He was 50 inches tall, 65 pounds. He had blonde hair and was last seen wearing blue jeans, a white t shirt, and riding a black and red bicycle. Next was Christopher Byers, 48 inches tall, 52 pounds. He had light brown hair and was dressed in blue jeans, dark shoes, and a white long sleeve shirt. He was carrying a skateboard when he disappeared. And the third in the trio, Michael Moore, 49.5 inches tall, 55 pounds, brown hair, wearing blue Boy Scout pants, a blue Boy Scout shirt, an orange and blue Scout hat, and riding a light green bicycle. The parents of the boys were Melissa and John Byers, Christopher's step-parents, Pamela and Terry Hobbs, Stevie's parents, and Dana and Todd Moore, Michael's parents. The three boys also shared a common after-school routine. They would finish school, meet at Stevie's house, and then split up to go to each other's homes before heading home once again. The timeline on the day they disappeared is approximated as follows. 2:30 p.m. Stevie is checked out of school by his mother, Pamela Hobbs, and returns home. He shows his completed homework. 3:05 p.m. Michael Moore arrives at the Hobbs residence. The boys ask if Stevie can go to Michael's house. After a brief protest, Pamela finally allows it. 3:35 p.m. Christopher Byers arrives at the Hobbs home, learns that Stevie and Michael just left, and begins searching for them. 4:15 p.m. Terry Hobbs, Stevie's stepfather, gets home from work. By this point, Stevie has not yet returned, and his mother threatens a 2-week grounding if he is not back by 4:30. 4:45 p.m. Stevie is still missing. Terry takes Pamela to work, promising to look for Stevie after. 6:30 p.m. Both Christopher and Michael are last seen by their parents. A neighbor reports seeing the three boys riding their bikes and skateboard past her house, followed by Terry shouting at them. Around 7 p.m., John Mark Byers files a missing person report for Christopher. Between 5 and 9:18 p.m., while searching, Terry spends several hours with a friend, David Jacoby, quote, playing guitars and hanging out, rather than continuing the search. He later admits he left the house alone for up to 2 hours. 9:18 p.m. Terry picks up Pamela from work, drives her home, and asks their younger daughter Amanda where Stevie is. Amanda replies that they cannot find him. 9:25 p.m. The Hobbs family finally reports Stevie missing, prompting a small-scale night search of the surrounding woods, including the area around Interstate 40 and Robin Hood Hills. The next morning, May 6, 1993, juvenile officer Steve Jones responds to a tip and drives to the Devil's Den drainage ditch and spots a tennis shoe floating in the water. Officer Mike Allen meets Jones at the ditch, slips into the water, and his leg becomes caught on a submerged log. While trying to free himself, he feels a body snagged to his leg. The first body is pulled free, confirming that the shoe belonged to a victim. Over the next few minutes, the bodies of all three boys are recovered from the water-filled drainage ditch, which investigators described as a large, muddy, swamp-like creek to issue a trigger warning as there are graphic details that will be recounted. I won't go into any unnecessary detail, but I need to describe what happened to the boys. The three bodies were nude, bound at the wrists and ankles with shoelaces, and placed in the ditch with their arms tied to their feet, otherwise known as hogtied. Christopher Byers displayed genital mutilation and, quote, excision, leading investigators initially to suspect a sexual component to the crime. Additional trauma included blunt force injuries, lacerations, stab wounds, and post-mortem lividity on the buttocks and back. Clothing and shoes were also recovered, some of which were found pinned down by sticks. Notably, 2 pairs of underwear were never recovered. The Crittenden County coroner, who arrived at the scene around 3:20 p.m. on May 6th, documented the positioning of each body. Each lay on the west ditch bank, with the right hand tied to the right ankle and the left hand tied to the left ankle by shoelaces. The first body, Stevie, showed head lacerations, lividity on the buttocks and back, and had rigor mortis beginning to set in. The second body, Christopher, exhibited facial and neck lacerations, lividity on the left side, and similar rigor mortis. The third body, Michael, was described as emasculated, and also displayed lividity and rigor mortis. All 3 bodies showed post-mortem staining on the face and chest, indicating they had been submerged for several hours. Coroner's notes also indicated that the bodies were already in an advanced stage of decomposition when found, consistent with being in the water overnight or for up to a full day. Because the water had washed away much potential trace evidence, DNA recovery was severely limited. Dr. Frank Peretti, the local medical examiner, performed the autopsies. He concluded that Stevie Branch and Michael Moore died from injuries combined with drowning, while Christopher Byers died solely from his injuries. Peretti asserted that a knife had been used for the genital mutilation, and that the boys had been sexually assaulted, a claim that was later challenged by independent forensic pathologists who noted that Peretti had failed the medical examiner board certification exam twice and was in fact not board certified. Peretti's estimate of the time of death placed the window between 6 p.m. and 7:45 p.m., with a most likely time being around 6 p.m. This suggests the victims were alive for a period after the last known sightings, approximately 6:30 p.m., and then submerged for several hours before discovery. The binding of the hands to the ankles with shoelaces, the nudity, and the genital mutilation were all noted as, quote, very unusual for a homicide in a small town, fueling early speculation about a ritualistic motive. The discovery shocked the tight-knit community. Parents, neighbors, and local officials were confronted with the horrific visual evidence. Photos and video of 3 children's bodies lying in a muddy ditch, partially clothed and bound. The town's satanic panic of the early 1990s was instantly activated. Residents began whispering about satanic rituals, occult symbols, and the ominous number 3, which many associated with 666, or diabolic numerology. This cultural backdrop would heavily influence the direction of the police investigation, the media narrative, and, ultimately, the legal strategies employed in the ensuing trials. When the bodies were pulled from the water-filled ditch on the morning of May 6, 1993, West Memphis police were thrust into a crisis that quickly morphed from a routine missing children case to a full-scale homicide investigation. The coroner's report, arriving at 3:20 p.m., confirmed that the 3 victims had been bound, nude, and suffered severe blunt force injuries, a scenario that the investigators immediately deemed very unusual. Because the crime scene was muddy and swamp-like, much of the potential forensic material such as blood, tissue, and hair, had been washed away, leaving the department with little physical evidence to guide the case. The early 1990s were marked by a national satanic panic atmosphere, and any crime featuring any unusual binding or mutilation was instantly linked in the public imagination to occult rituals. Local residents began speculating that the number 3, the binding, and the genital mutilation could be ritualistic in nature, and the media quickly amplified these notions, portraying the murders as a satanic sacrifice. Seeking an expert on occult activity, the West Memphis Police Department called in Jerry Driver, a juvenile officer reputed to have extensive knowledge of satanic groups and cult connections. Driver was tasked with compiling a list of anyone in the area who might be involved in occult practices. The first name he produced was Damien Echols, a teenage outsider who, quote, fit the profile of a potential ritualist. Driver's list later expanded to include Jason Baldwin, Echols' close friend, and Jesse Miskelly, a classmate, none of whom had any forensic link to the crime scene. Echols was described as a high school dropout living in a mobile home, with an alternative appearance, long hair, black clothing, tattoos, including the word evil on his knuckles, and an interest in heavy metal music. In a town where such outward markers were rare, residents quickly labeled him as a potential satanist, even though his personal religious practice was actually Wicca, a faith often conflated with devil worship by the media. The police narrative leaned heavily on his look and lifestyle rather than any actual evidence. Compounding the suspicion were rumors that Echols allegedly drank human blood as part of a ritual, a claim that was unsubstantiated and likely a product of sensationalist gossip. Such allegations further entrenched the satanic ritual hypothesis in both law enforcement thinking and public opinion. Jesse Miskelly was a 17-year-old with an IQ of 72 and an intellectual disability. He was questioned without a parent, attorney, or guardian present. The police recorded only selected portions of the interview, a practice that is very wrong, because a minor with a low IQ is extremely vulnerable to coercive tactics. During the interrogation, detectives repeatedly prompted Jesse for details, fed him information about the timeline, and showed him a photograph of one of the victims' bodies, all of which added extra stress and likely contributed to a false confession. The detectives kept prompting him, saying, "If you tell us what time it was, we'll leave you alone." And Jesse eventually gave a confession to get the interrogation over with. Jesse's confession described the 3 teens attacking the boys, binding them, and beating them. He claimed to have held on to Michael when he tried to run, and recounted Damien striking Christopher in the head with his fist. This confession became the strongest piece of evidence for the prosecution, despite being obtained under dubious circumstances. The defense argued that the confession was coerced and therefore inadmissible. Prosecutors countered that the confession was voluntary and that the photo shown to Jesse was a common strategy to keep people talking. Ultimately, the jury accepted the confession and convicted Jesse, even though no physical evidence linked him to the crime. Police recruited Vicki Hutchinson, a neighbor of Jesse, to act as a covert informant. She was asked to obtain information from Jesse about Damien, and she subsequently claimed to have attended an alleged, quote, Espot, a Wiccan gathering, with Damien where participants were painted, undressed, and preparing for an orgy. Vicky's testimony was taken as evidence against Damien, and she reportedly passed a polygraph test, though she later recanted, admitting the account was fabricated. In May 19, 1993, detectives interviewed Mark Bayers, Christopher's stepfather, and extracted 30 pubic hairs for testing. The hair analysis, however, failed to produce any link to the crime, and Byers maintained an alibi. The prosecution also introduced testimony from Michael Roy Carson, an inmate who claimed that Jason Baldwin had confessed to him about the murders, and from two teenage girls who said they heard Damian Eccles confess at a softball game. Both sets of statements were later judged hearsay and of limited credibility. A combination of satanic panic rumors, graphic media coverage of the bodies, and the community's demand for someone behind bars created intense pressure on law enforcement officials to solve the case quickly. Police Chief Jerry Driver's focus on occult connections and the swift identification of the West Memphis Three were, in part, an effort to calm public fear and demonstrate decisive action. During the joint trial of Damian and Jason, the Bruton Rule prevented the use of Jesse's confession as evidence against the other defendants, because a co-defendant's confession, quote, cannot be used in a shared trial because it would affect jury perception. Despite this procedural safeguard, the overall narrative constructed by the prosecution still relied heavily on the confession's existence to portray the trio as a coordinated group of perpetrators. Jesse Miskelly was charged with first-degree murder for Michael Moore and second-degree murder for Stevie Branch and Christopher Byers. The judge ordered a separate adult trial since his confession could not be used against Damian or Jason under the Bruton Rule. There were numerous tactics employed by the defense team. First was coercion and vulnerability. The defense emphasized Jesse's IQ of 72, his intellectual disability, and the fact that he was questioned without an adult present. Second was selective recording. Only portions of the interrogation were recorded, which was labeled wrong by the defense and indicative of evidence suppression. Third was the psychological pressure. The defense pointed to the photograph and the detective's prompting as tactics designed to break Jesse's resistance. Fourth was the lack of physical evidence. No DNA, blood, or forensic link tied Jesse to the ditch. The prosecution's case rested entirely on the confession. On February 5, 1994, the jury convicted Jesse Miskelly of first-degree murder for Michael and second-degree murder for Stevie and Christopher. He received a life sentence plus 40 years. Jesse appealed on grounds of involuntary confession and due process violations. The Arkansas Supreme Court upheld the conviction on February 19, 1996, finding that the trial record did not demonstrate the requisite coercion to overturn the verdict. Due to the previously mentioned Bruton Rule, Damian and Jason were tried together but separately from Jesse and without Jesse's confession as evidence. The prosecution's narrative in this case was the satanic ritual motive. Prosecutor John Fogelman framed the murders as a ritualistic satanic act, citing the binding, nudity, and genital mutilation. They also had what was called occult expert testimony. An expert linked black nail polish, dyed hair, tattoos, and the full moon timing to satanic practices, reinforcing the evil teen stereotype. Next was the physical evidence. There was a serrated knife recovered from a lake 5 months after the arrests that was claimed to be Damian's and, quote, consistent with the wounds. And fiber matches, a fiber from Damian's shirt and a red house coat fiber from Jason's home, were presented as secondary transfer evidence linking the teens to the scene. Next was witness testimony. Vicky Hutchinson, the covert informant, described the alleged S-bot with Damian, claiming that he boasted about being evil. She passed a polygraph, which at the time lent credibility to the prosecution. And inmate Michael Roy Carson alleged Jason confessed to him in jail. The defense had numerous counter-arguments. First, the forensics were weak. They highlighted that water washed away DNA, leaving no viable biological evidence. The fibers could have come from any source, as, quote, fibers are everywhere. Second was the mutilation precision. They argued that the genital mutilation required surgical precision impossible for two teenagers in the dark, underwater, suggesting a third party or a adult perpetrator who likely specialized in surgery or perhaps hunting. Next was the alternative suspects. They presented Mark Byers, the stepfather, and Terry Hobbs, a second stepfather, as viable suspects. A bloody knife given to documentary filmmakers matched Byers' blood type. Hair found at the scene matched Terry Hobbs. Next was the occult expert rebuttal. Exposed the stereotyping of black nail polish equaling satanic as cultural bias, noting that pentagrams and dark clothing do not constitute proof of criminal intent. They also brought up timing discrepancies. They pointed out the coroner's time of death window and that conflicted with the teens' alibis and the confession's timeline, which the prosecution had already prompted. Lastly were the questionable witnesses. They emphasized that Vicky's testimony was later recanted, and the jailhouse informant testimony was deemed hearsay and unreliable. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts for both defendants. Damian Eccles was sentenced to death, the state's maximum penalty for a capital murder, and Jason Baldwin received a life without parole sentence. Both men appealed on multiple grounds: ineffective counsel, lack of forensic evidence, coerced testimony, and new DNA findings. The Arkansas Supreme Court upheld both convictions in late 1996, despite the defense's arguments that new DNA evidence was inconclusive and the occult narrative was prejudicial. After the convictions, the defense mounted a series of appeals that stretched into the new millennium. In 1996, the Arkansas Supreme Court upheld the convictions of all three men, despite growing doubts about the forensic evidence. A breakthrough came in 2004 when independent investigators recovered a small amount of DNA from the crime scene. The profile did not match any of the West Memphis 3 and could not be linked to the victims. The defense used this finding to petition the state Supreme Court for a new trial, but the court dismissed the request on the basis that the DNA results were inconclusive and did not constitute proof of innocence. The case re-entered the national spotlight with the release of the Paradise Lost documentary series in the early 2000s. The films highlighted procedural misconduct, the lack of physical evidence, and the role of satanic panic hysteria, galvanizing a coalition of celebrities and activists who raised funds for new testing and legal fees. This media attention kept the case alive in the public conscience and created political pressure on Arkansas officials to reconsider the convictions. By the late 2000s, the Arkansas Attorney General, wary of a costly retrial and the inevitable civil rights damages, offered the three men an Alford plea, a legal device that allows defendants to maintain innocence while acknowledging that the state has enough evidence for a conviction. Jesse Miskelly and Damian Eccles accepted the plea immediately, seeing it as a path to freedom. Jason Baldwin was reluctant, fearing that a guilty plea would cement his criminal record, but he ultimately consented after weeks of pressure from friends and family. On August 19, 2011, all three entered the Alford plea and were released from prison after serving approximately 18 years. Now that the West Memphis 3 are free, there are 4 main alternative suspects that have been proposed over the years. First is Terry Hobbs, Stevie Branch's stepfather. First, there was hair found at the ditch that matched Hobbs, and this is a direct physical trace from the crime scene that matches a suspect's DNA. It's a classic forensic link. Second, a pocket knife belonging to Stevie was discovered in Hobbs' lockbox after the murders. The victim's personal knife should have been with his body. Finding it in Hobbs' possession suggests he retrieved it after the crime. Next is a 2-hour alibi gap. Hobbs claimed he was with friend David Jacoby, but Jacoby later said Hobbs was unaccounted for up to 2 hours on the night of the murders. An unexplained window of time gives Hobbs the opportunity to commit the killings and cover his tracks. Next is a history of violence. Hobbs had been charged with aggravated assault. He shot his brother-in-law and accused of domestic violence, and previously break-in and sexual assault allegations. Prior violent behavior raises the probability that he could have escalated to murder. There's also family testimony. Hobbs' nephew, Michael Hobbs Jr., reported that Hobbs bragged about killing the 3 boys and that the family considered it an open secret. Plus, there's the neighbor's observation. A neighbor said he saw Hobbs yelling at the boys on the night they vanished. Taken together, these points create a forensic, behavioral, and circumstantial picture that many observers argue makes Hobbs a credible alternative perpetrator. Next is Mark Byers, Christopher Byers' stepfather. There was the bloody knife given to the documentary filmmakers. Byers handed them a serrated knife with blood in the hinge to the Paradise Lost crew. Testing showed the blood matched both Christopher Byers and Mark Byers. He also admitted to hitting Christopher with a belt on the day of his disappearance. This demonstrates a willingness to use physical violence on the victim. Next, hair and pubic hair samples were taken from Byers early in the investigation, but there was no conclusive DNA match ever produced. However, the lack of a match does not exonerate him. Lastly, he had no alibi for the night of the murders and could not say where he was, and no one remembers seeing him anywhere either. Moving away from the family aspect, our next suspect is Mr. Bojangles, a disoriented man at a fast food restaurant. There was a police report of a black man with blood on his face and arm entering a Bojangles restroom shortly after the boys disappeared. A blood sample was collected the next day, but was never tested, and detectives later admitted the evidence was lost. The man was allegedly wearing a cast on one arm, which would make it difficult to restrain 3 children, so this later casted doubt on his involvement, but does not fully rule him out. Lastly is the tattooed hitchhiker theory. A man named Ken Govar picked up a hitchhiker with a large devil tattoo on his forearm. The hitchhiker insisted on being left at a convenience store in West Memphis at 3:30 p.m., the same window where the boys were last seen. The hitchhiker had an intense, angry demeanor, and the devil tattoo fit the satanic panic profile that the police were going for. There was no follow-up investigation, however. Police never identified the hitchhiker or traced his movements after he was dropped off. And people believe he may have been a serial killer, as the description matches a pattern of transient violent offenders who sometimes target children. So what do you think? Do you think the West Memphis 3 were guilty and got away with it? Well, not really got away with it, they did serve 18 years, but were later found innocent in the court of public opinion? Or do you think someone else did it? Was it one of the stepfathers? Was it the tattooed hitchhiker? Was it Mr. Bojangles? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for listening to The Evidence Locker. This episode was written and hosted by me, Shay, and edited by my husband, Toby. If you like our podcast, please give us a like and a follow and leave a review. It really helps us. Thank you for listening. Join us next week as we open another locker. Stay curious, stay safe.